You might have heard that AI can hallucinate, things like ChatGPT or other large language models. But what does that actually mean? And what can you do about it? And more interestingly, when can it actually be a good thing? That's something I'm going to cover today. I'm a Johns Hopkins trained AI expert. We're going to be drawing on some research and information from IBM here as well. So the first thing to answer here is really, what is an AI hallucination? And it's basically when a large language model imagines some information that doesn't exist, but that is consistent with the query you put into it. So imagine that I asked for the 10 best barbecue restaurants in Lafayette, California, which is a place that I happen to live. Maybe there's 3 in the area, but I've asked the model for 10. It's going to look at its training data and find the 3, but then it's not going to know what to do with the gap that I've left there, the extra 7. And so there's a very high probability that it will essentially make up non-existent barbecue restaurants based on patterns it's seen in its training data. And that's what an AI hallucination is, ultimately. It's when the model is asked to do something or provide some information that is not present in its training data, so it follows the patterns in that data and makes something up. And this can be very problematic because since it does follow those patterns, it's going to be a very realistic sounding result, which makes it very hard for people to weed out these hallucinations because they're usually not crazy. They're usually things that sound kind of plausible. So maybe in Lafayette, there's Horn Barbecue, for example. There's Dad's Barbecue, and you might find another like Lucille's in the general area. And then it might imagine Mom's Barbecue, for example, based on that pattern. It might write a really compelling and interesting description of that restaurant that doesn't exist. And there's been some other relatively high-profile examples of that happening. Here from IBM, talks about Google's Bard chatbot, now known as Gemini, imagining that the James Webb Space Telescope had captured images of a planet outside our solar system that feels plausible. It feels like it would flow from the training data, but it did not, in fact, do that, and so that is a hallucination. Now, the second thing to know about hallucinations is how to prevent them, how to avoid them. The first thing is just to be cautious when you ask a large language model to answer a question where it might have incomplete data. You're more likely to get hallucinations when you're asking about very niche or specific topics, or you're doing something like the example I gave of asking for more restaurants than actually exist in a given place. And think about that in the context of other things. If you're asking it to give very specific information where that information may not exist or may not be available, you're going to be more likely to get hallucinations. Versus if you ask it to name all the state capitals in the United States, it's very likely that it is going to get that right, because you're not asking it to kind of extrapolate beyond the information that's going to be in its training data. If you're building your own large language model or you're building an application, it's also very important to give it data that it can work from. You're much less likely to get hallucinations when you hand data to a model than if you just ask it to draw on its existing training data. So again, if I gave a list of all the restaurants in Lafayette and said, okay, give me the 10 best barbecue restaurants, it would probably find the right ones, and it would probably say, oh, I only found 3 of them because I'm looking at this data. I don't see any more, and it wouldn't imagine the other ones. Also giving it a very specific purpose, like saying, you are a restaurant critic, you're only going to focus on restaurants that actually exist, that are actually in the town. Here's my question about restaurants. It probably wouldn't hallucinate and imagine ones that aren't there if you give it that much more limited kind of prompt. So there's a lot of ways to basically avoid the issue of having these hallucinations, to minimize the situations where they might occur. And then, of course, you need to be checking the data when you get it out of an LLM, particularly for more novel queries. It's very important to fact check what you get because, again, these hallucinations can be very, very hard to spot. A perfect example of this is a lawyer actually cited a bunch of cases from ChatGPT. Turns out those cases were completely irrelevant to the brief he was preparing, and he got in a lot of trouble for doing that. Now, it wasn't necessarily that the cases didn't exist, it's just that ChatGPT kind of hallucinated quotes from them, meanings from them, conclusions that weren't really real. And if he had checked it over more carefully, he would have noticed, hey, these cases do exist, but that quote's actually not from that case. It's from something entirely different. So especially on quotes and specific information, it's very important to check and do fact checking to make sure that those hallucinations don't come in and become a problem. Now, the third thing to know, though, is that hallucinations from LLMs are not always a bad thing. They can actually be very useful. And so this article points out, and I've seen in my own work, that asking an LLM or kind of setting up an LLM to hallucinate can be a very interesting way to build some creativity into the way that these models operate. And a lot of the time, these models are really trained to go very close to their training data and the prompt. And they're not going to imagine new things, new information. Sometimes you want that. You want a novel concept, a new idea for a YouTube video, for something in your business, or a very novel image, for example, if you're working with Midjourney or something along those lines. Now, most LLMs, most image generation AIs as well, will give you an ability to set what's called a temperature. So it's basically, you can kind of make it a little bit more likely to hallucinate, essentially, more likely to come up with novel things. And there's a trade-off between a higher temperature, a higher probability of hallucinations, and creativity in a positive way, and also, coming up with something that doesn't exist in a negative one. So you have to set this depending on the prompt. But if you're looking for the LLM to come up with something novel and creative, try setting that temperature very high. Try setting the novelty of your responses very high. You're basically asking the LLM to hallucinate, and in doing so, it may find interesting patterns in the training data and come up with something wholly new that you wouldn't have thought of. And that, again, can be very valuable in areas like art and design, and also data visualization and even ideation for concepts in your business, or coming up again with content ideas. So try to avoid hallucinations whenever possible if you're trying to come up with very accurate data, but embrace LLM hallucinations when you need something novel, because it's really the closest that they're going to come to true creativity. If you found this helpful in any way, please do subscribe to my channel for plenty more information about how LLMs work and how to use AI in your day-to-day life. Make sure to like the video, and you can also head over to AI Automate It, all one word. It's a link in the description too, to join my newsletter for a lot more info.